Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenheart. And it came to pass, as he went to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. Now, when he was entered into a certain village, behold, there met him 10 men, by the way, who stood afar off and were leprous. When they saw him, they said, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when Jesus saw them, he said, Go and show thyself unto the priest. And it came to pass that as they went, they were cleansed. Now, behold, one of them, when he saw that he was cleansed, he turned back and with a loud voice glorified God. So here we have starting of a new story here in the 17th chapter of Luke, still in the early part. Now we just saw where it opened up with it must needs be that offenses come, one to that man by who it come. And then we saw it's better that a millstone be hung around somebody's neck than for him to offend one of these little ones, saying, Take heed to yourself. If thy brother offend against thee, rebuke him, and if he repent, forgive him, even if it happens sometimes in a day. And we saw the disciples ask the Lord a question, increase our faith, right? That he went onto the grain of a mustard seed, faith, if you be able to say unto this sycamore tree, be up, plucked up by the root and planted in the sea, and then we saw that servant who was out in the field, either plowing or feeding cattle, saying that if he comes home, will the Lord tell him to go and sit down and eat, but rather serve me, and then afterwards you can eat. So, taking a break from a storyline, we've been connecting since like maybe the last two chapters, straight, with the prodigal son, the wasteful steward, and, the unrighteous mammon. These things, they were, bouncing off each other. So now we get to go in a new direction. Then as he's journeying towards Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So we know that this is the second time, at least, it's being said that, when he knew that his time was come, that he steadfastly set his face to go towards Jerusalem, and how he would even send, disciples ahead of him, messengers to prepare a place in this village of the Samaritans. So, still journeying, understanding that this journey is such a prolonged, journey. It's not like when the time came, he went right there. But we see him doing a slow dance, journeying towards this place, covering as much tracks, as he could, still teaching as much as he can, healing, doing all these miracles, making disciples and believers of men. So this is just a reminder that he is still on his journey towards, Jerusalem, that he did not, get thrown off. This reminds us of the woman with the issue of blood, how he was going to Jairus. It was Jairus that came unto him first, to come and heal his daughter, and he was going with Jairus. When she touched him, so then he stopped and, he addressed this whole issue, right? That he continued unto Jairus. So it's kind of the same thing, how, he was journeying towards Jerusalem, right? And then, all these things are happening. So this is just a reminder that he's still, journeying towards Jerusalem. It goes to show you that in, a journey or in accomplishing something, you have one big goal, right? But then you have many thousands of little goals that, are spread throughout this, huge goal. And, it shows ability to keep your eye on the bottom line. It shows an ability to not get thrown off. It shows an ability to accomplish something, understanding that, using this to accomplish a greater purpose. I think that as human beings, we can get the blind, the horse blinders, we can get, sidetracked. We can go down a rabbit hole and pursue it all the way. And it will seem as if by the time we make our way out, on the other side, we forgot, what we were trying to accomplish. We forgot, how we ended up there. We forgot, everything, what we were, set out to do, how we got sidetracked, this thing that we even just, this rabbit hole that we went down, what was the purpose of that in relation to the bigger goal that we were trying to accomplish, right? So we see Jesus here taking on such a dynamic, command of will, a dynamic command of planning and purpose. He's taking such a dynamic, command of, being and existing and keeping in mind the ultimate goal, right? How it was at Jerusalem that all these things would take place. So we see it's being here, said how as he, went to Jerusalem, he passed through these places. So, like I said, not forgetting the bottom line. And, it shows how, we should be operating. Like I said, in accomplishing something, we have the goal, which is usually what we, want to do. But then, it's the inexperienced person that might say, well, I just go directly for this goal, right? If a person wants to be a doctor, right? First, they have to finish, elementary school, high school. They have to do their undergrad. And then, they go to medical school. I know that some countries, you don't need an undergrad, degree to go to medical school. But, in wanting to be a doctor, they couldn't just say, okay, I'm gonna go be a doctor. I'm gonna go down to the hospital and say, hey, I'm interested in being a doctor, right? Or even something easier, just go right to med school, having not completed, these previous years of education, but how the person would not get sidetracked by their high school or their college graduation, forgetting what the purpose was for these things, how these were keys to open this door to medical school, which would then open the door to being this doctor. All right, so this is just to keep us close by, so that it knows that we're still on this journey that we set out to do, and that we haven't lost our way. We haven't forgotten why we're here. We haven't forgotten the original goal, which was to get to Jerusalem. Showing that things, they're working out as they should. We know that all things work together for good for them that love God, who are the called according to His purpose, right? So we see here it being mentioned how He passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee, right? Now we know that Nazareth of Galilee is where He grew up, and how they rejected Him. That was the first place He went, after being baptized, and how they wanted to throw Him head down off the hill, because He started out with such a rebuke on them, saying that, well, how there were so many lepers in Israel during that famine in the days of Elias, but only this woman of Sidon, a city of Sarepta, a non-Jew, was healed. How many lepers were in Israel in the days of Eliseus, Elisha, the prophet? But none of them were cleansed, save Naaman the Syrian, another non-Israelite, and how they got angry. They led him to the hill that they might cast him down headlong. This was in Nazareth. So we see Samaria here being mentioned. So I'm doing a little light reading. I found that Samaria, they were actually Jews. We know that it is said that the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans, right? When he was at the well with that woman, you know, the one who he told, the husband that she has now is not hers, and she has had 5 husbands. That's not her. When she heard it, she was amazed, say, I perceive that thou art a prophet. So the Samaritans, they were actually, diluted Jews, and it was said they were from the north region. We understand that, when they were taken into Babylon, in the captivity, we know that some Jews were left behind, especially when, the Babylonians wanted to live in the land. They did not know the customs of the God of Israel. And they came there, with all their, things, how they are, right? Even some of the things that, Israel was doing, that made them get in trouble. And I believe, was it lions that the Lord sent among them and slew them? And, they had to call back for some of the Jews to show them, the law, their God, how to live, and be clean in his eyes. What customs, does he require? What are we doing wrong that's triggering his response, like this? I believe it was lions that he sent among them, right? Just lions, and they were just, slaying everybody. No guns were there in that day, which, they could have answered so greatly, right? But then, at the same time, if God has pronounced something against you, you understand that you're going to go through that one way or the other, right? You might get lucky and try to delay it. You might get lucky and try to, dodge it. You might get lucky and try to sleep with one eyes open. But if God has pronounced something, you're going to go through that. And, for them trampling upon his law, doing the same very thing, even worse, why he sent Israel to Babylon, for idol worship and all the customs that they had, when he gave the Moses Levitical law, I always say that, it's because of, remember the Noah, the Lord, he destroyed the earth by flood. These laws that he gave are the things that grieved him. So more than likely, these people, they came, these Babylonians, and they basically, in Noah's flood, they were living exactly like them, even worse, right? Because we know that over time, mankind, we get more creative. We take a concept or a principle, and we expand on it, we extrapolate, and we follow the trajectory to, if it were to go further, how would it look? How would it end up? And we're able to be even way worse versions of our previous people. So the Samaritans, they were Jews in the north region that were left from when Israel was taken to Babylon, and they mixed these, we know that they were given by Moses that thou shalt not make marriages with the people of the land. You shall not give, your daughters unto their sons for wife, neither shall you take their daughters unto your sons, to be wives, lest, you forget the Lord your God and he spew you out of this land. So, this northern region is where this all happened, and they mixed with the Babylonians and the Assyrians. It was said how they, the 5 books of Moses, that they kept this, but it's like they had a alternate. They changed, pieces of it. It wasn't really said if it was, how they enacted these changes. Was it traditions? Did they just read through it and decide to give their own spin of every, law? So they had, a different version of the, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? And they didn't acknowledge the temple in Jerusalem, which was it Joshua, or was it David or Solomon? It was one of these guys when they said that if that people should sin against thee, and they turn their faces towards this city, this temple, and pray, then thou shalt hear from heaven and forgive. So this temple in Jerusalem was acknowledged by all Israel, and that was a standard. But they ended up building their own temple, right? So they had their own temple and their own version of the five books of Moses. So now here's the separation, right? So then when Israel came back from Babylon, they did not mix or meddle with these northerners. So when decree, was it Darius, I believe, of Medes and Persia, was given to rebuild the temple, Israel that came back from Babylon, that was their doing. They were to build this temple. But these northerners, these Samaritans, they decided to help. They wanted to help them build the temple, but they refused them. They said that you're not of our faith anymore. The customs, the social things, were too different, and they refused their help. And it was said that this was what sparked such a great division among them. So because they didn't help them, allow them to help them build the temple, this caused such a great division, and they became enemies like this. Now the woman at the well, we would remember how that story went, how Jesus said salvation is of the Jews, signifying and leading us to infer that well, and this was actually in the commentary, this part is not my own revelation, then that would lead you to say, then if salvation is of the Jews, when he was Jesus himself, speaking to this woman at the well, then we know that the Samaritans, their faith was not, accepted by God. How they changed the law of Moses and they had their own temple, right? I think that, things like this in the Bible, when you catch these truths, that, it might be said in one or two lines, but, you stand on it as if it was covered throughout the whole Bible. So as he went to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. So the next verse says, and it came to pass when he was entered into a certain village, behold, there met him 10 men standing afar off who were lepers. So he's entering to a certain village, right? So now, this is not mentioned, is he in Galilee or Samaria, right? You notice that, right? He said that he passed through the midst of these two cities, Samaria and Galilee. But then it said he entered into a certain village, right? So is he in Samaria? Is he in Galilee, right? Is he somewhere else? No, we don't know. It's not given. So this effect would be given to let us understand the difference in cultures and faiths and beliefs of these surrounding areas. These two areas that is like the difference between night and day. But yet still he's gonna pass through them. So expecting that, well, you have to carry yourself a certain way. You have to be willing to understand certain things. When you meet these people. I think that cultural competency, cultural respect is important. If you're going to speak to people, especially something like this, it is Jesus himself who said, be wise as serpents but harmless as doves. It's the wise man that winneth souls, right? So in practicing wisdom, you have to know where you are, and carry yourself, I guess, accordingly, not compromising who you are or what you believe, but understanding that certain people, they have certain things, and if you're just gonna go there and just upset everybody, tick them off, and have everybody mad at you, then you wasted your entire time. You might as well have stayed home, right? Now there's a difference between a person rejecting truth versus you walking with respect in a relation to people, right? There's a difference between them rejecting truth versus you not walking with respect in reference to these people. So these five lepers, they met him standing afar off. So that, remember, with the custom of leprosy, they were shut out of the camp. They were not allowed to be in contact with anyone. If they were in the vicinity of people, they had to cover their upper lip. They had in when people got in proximity to them, they had to raise their hands up and say unclean, unclean. That was given to Moses in these Levitical laws. So they're standing afar off, respecting the custom, because things could happen to them. They could be put to death, or whatever else might happen to them, because we know leprosy is a contagious disease. It's a mycobacterium. And I've always given this about the organism, how it divides so slowly that it takes a year or two to kill, because the medication, it targets it usually at the dividing phase, because it if I believe it forms spores, right? And they are so survivable to the harshest environments. So this cell might sit there for an entire 8 months and not divide. But then the second it does, you got to be ready to catch it, right? So that's why it takes so long. So comparing to regular bacteria who divides, thousands of times per minute, right, per hour. So they made him these 10 men. So no doubt, a buzz was created that Jesus is nearby. No doubt his fame had spread throughout all these regions. Like, as much as they were leprosy, they were lepers, they still was able to hear of his fame, his feats, his healing blind, deaf, lame, woman with the issue of blood. It was right after the miracle of the fishes, the catch, and when he healed Simon Peter's wife's mother of that fever. It was said that he was in a certain city, and a man, full of leprosy, ran and fell on his face and besought him, saying, "If thou wilt not come make me clean." And Jesus actually put forth his hand and touched him, touched this leprous man, saying, "I will be thou clean." Now, I guess the difference, for a typical person is if they touch this person, then no, they are contaminated. But Jesus, when he touched him, he was made clean and pure. So he at least, one leper before meeting this man. And I always say that, he might have healed so many in between. It's just that, their story might not have been significant enough to emphasize a certain teaching point. So, maybe they were just mixed in when it would have been said, and he laid his hands on the multitude and healed them all, right? But this is at least the second person that he's healed from leprosy. So now they hear about him and they come, you know, within the city, you can say, but still standing afar off. The fact that they had to stand afar off means that they were somewhere they were probably not supposed to be. So, these men come in having heard of Jesus. What can we lose if we go there and nothing happens? Then there's no change. We're still the same as we were, yesterday and the day before. So nothing really lost. But if there stands a chance that we could be, healed, and hearing all these things about him, knowing how capable he is, yeah, this was almost a guaranteed thing that something could be done for them. But still respecting the social distancing, in all Israel, the Moses Levitical laws, it was shown how a garment can be leprous, how a house can be leprous, possessions when come into contact, how it would change color, have a certain stain, look to it, and how the solution was to watch it for 7 days and see if it spreads or gets worse, before they would pronounce it unclean. I believe that if it was in a house, even the lumber would have to be pulled apart and then it burnt. So you enter into a certain city, not given the location, passing through Samaria and Galilee. So now here we are in this place that's not mentioned, likely to emphasize that we have Jews and non-Jews that we can encounter at any point. All right, so the next verse says, "And when they saw him, they lifted up their voice, saying, 'Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.'" So them crying out. Now, have we seen him ignore somebody that has cried out? Have we seen Jesus ignore somebody that's lifted up their voice? I don't think that we have. I think the closest we came was that lady with her daughter, the one that he told is not meat to take the children's bread and cast it to the little dogs. But even she got, what she was looking for when she said, "Of a truth, Master, but even the dogs eat from the crumbs that fall from the Master's table." Blind Bartimaeus lifted up his voice. He got what he was wanting. The previous man with leprosy, he lifted up his voice. There's one person that did not get. I can see it was the man who said, after Jesus was teaching, when they bring you before the synagogues, magistrates, and powers, take no thought how or what thing you shall answer or say. For the Holy Ghost shall teach you in that same hour what things you ought to say, and how this man, he lifted up his voice, saying, "Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me." So he did not get what he was wanting. Jesus, said to the multitude, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in abundance of things where he possesseth." When this man asked for this, he spoke of covetousness. That so far I think is the only guy we see not getting what when he lifted up his voice. Like I said, Jairus' daughter, she was sick. He got that. Centurion who sent the servants unto him, "Master, I'm not even worried that thou should enter under my roof." Jesus pronounced that healing without even going to the house, right? Even the demon possessed people, when they would see him and fall before him, saying, "Let us alone. What have I to do with thee, thou Jesus, Son of God Most High?" Even those were casted out. So they say, "Have mercy on us." Did they ask in words to be healed from leprosy? Were they so, leprous, their skin, that, it was obvious that, it didn't take, them needing to ask for this thing? Because, or did they ask, in words, "Heal us of this leprosy," but it's just not written here in Luke. And we would find it in Matthew, Mark, or John. Even blind Bartimaeus, when Jesus called for him, he asked him, "What will I that what will you that I do for you? Jesus asked him, and he said, Lord, that I may receive my sight. So, blind Bartimaeus being obviously blind, and they had to lead him over. Obviously, Jesus would know what, he was asking for, or what he would ask for. So was it the same, with these men? Did he ask them, what will I? And, they said, cure us of this leprosy, but it's just not written here, just to save space to emphasize other things. So, they said, have mercy on us. Have mercy on us. Have mercy. Have mercy on us, because this life is hard. Have mercy on us because we're shut out from the camp. We can't live a normal life and we're missing out on everything. We can't, afford to have a wife or children, no family, just being there by themselves. Have mercy on us. Because you know that when Jesus healed, it was always said that he had compassion on them. When he fed them with the fishes and the loaves, when he lifted up his eyes, he beheld the people as sheep having no shepherd. Then, he said, if I send these people away, they shall faint in the way. Because some of them, diverse of them came from far. When he saw that man with the leprosy, compassion. When he was entering into the city called Nain, how he saw that woman bringing out her dead son. It was said, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. So, Jesus, he leads with compassion. He's not, in this for fame. And, I always say that that's maybe the difference between him and, us, today. How I think that, the fame would more, catch our attention than the compassion. And this thing is also a subtle thing, right? Because, you could have two people, two ministers, one that heals for fame and one that heals for compassion. And, if you didn't watch them very closely, you might even think that, they are, exactly the same. But, there's a difference, when a person leads with compassion, because compassion is for the other person, fame is for you, doing things, imagining how people will talk about it, doing things, imagine, the monetary gain, you get more followers, people come to you, giving you gifts and things, when you do things, not from a place of compassion, but rather, for the gains, the person that does it for the gain, they usually walk with a different demeanor. The person that does it for the gain, you know, they have a different heart, a different mind. Now we know that the Spirit of God, how it selects who it falls on. It was said of David that he was a man after God's own heart. Now, we know that David, he wrote most of the Psalms. And if you read them, you can see why. A person after gain, they don't speak like that. Person after gain don't think like that. Person after gain. Because, the irony, and this is so ironic, right? I'm speaking about gain and compassion here. But, it was when Goliath showed up, right? It was said that whosoever killeth this man, how the king would bless him and, give him even his daughter-in-law. When David heard it, he said, who am I that the king's daughter-in-law should be given unto me? And as much as, the men there, they were after gain, how, afraid they were. How afraid they were to approach onto this challenge as much as they were driven by gain. The money and this status, being the king's son-in-law, and it showed you that only a passionate one could, rise in this situation that was defined by gain. So, isn't that ironic how when gain was on the table, that those that desired gain, they were too afraid to approach the table. But the compassionate one, not being driven by the gain, was the one that was able to rise to the occasion. So have, mercy on us, in this moment, they're attempting to use, I guess, common sense observation as opposed to eloquent words, eloquent words describing their situation, their condition, how they suffer, the things that they have to deal with and face. Eloquent words to, describe the majesty of God or even of Jesus himself. The eloquent words to, paint such a picture where, it wouldn't seem too much of imposition, them asking for this help. But instead of using these words, they're showing is that look at us. We don't need to tell you much. You can see what's going on here. And what we show you right now, I think it will be more, it will speak more words than any words we can say, in this moment. All right, so the next verse says, and when Jesus saw them, he said unto them, go and show yourself unto the priests. And it came to pass as they went, they were cleansed. So, we have Jesus here giving unusual, healing. Usually we've seen him, lay his hands on them. We've seen him make the spittle and, put it in either the eyes or the ears. We've seen him rebuke these unclean spirits and they come out. We've seen that them touch the border of his garment after the woman with the issue of blood. The next city he went to, they laid all the people out in the streets and everyone touched the border of his garment. I know that this is not really emphasized. You would think that it only happened that one time. But you see, the next city he went to, they laid everybody in the streets and they all touched the border of his garment and were healed. So he's sending them here to his priest. Now, I guess, Is this a test of faith? We would see in the Old Testament, Naaman the Syrian, who I was just speaking of when the prophet came, when he went to the prophet sent him to wash in the Jordan 7 times. And he was angry, because he thought, I thought he would come and touch me and, wave some, magic bush over me or sprinkle, whatever he would do, physically to me at that moment, and I would be healed. And it was his servant that had to, talk sense into him, saying, if he had asked you to do some hard thing, would you not have done it? Just try it and see if it works. And when he did, it works. It worked. So now we see, these 7 lepers, right? So far we've seen individual people, either they're coming because they're blind or deaf. Leprosy, that the previous guy, it was just one person. The woman with the issue of blood touching his the border of his garment. People coming for their children, Jairus' daughter, that man whose son, the spirit take him, he suddenly cried out and, it teareth him and he foameth again and it bruiseth him, hardly depart from him. We've seen it's just been one person. If they're coming for their child or, when they climbed up on the roof, it was 4 guys that had that, man with the palsy in the bed. But he was still, they carried him, but it was only the one person that got healed. So now here we have 10 guys, right? So, I would, speculate, is this why he chose a different approach? Because, to heal his hands on 10 different people, right? Was he in a rush? Could I also ask that question? Was he in a rush to get to the next place? Did he choose in the moment to not give this, too much time, right? We know that, he does, things for his own reason. But, instead of laying hands on 10 people, is this why he did this? Is there a reason why, he chose such a route? Is this an obedience thing? Was there something about these men? I can only speculate, right? That, obedience was what Jesus was calling from them. Maybe they did things, maybe they lived their life in a certain way. Maybe there were circumstances that, obedience was being called into question for these men. This is a sign of obedience. It's also, a test of faith. Would they believe, or would they just walk away from their blessing? Would they see it all the way through? Would they, receive his words? So when he saw them, he sent them to the priest, to go and show themselves. So, have you ever tried to accomplish something and, you didn't know what you were doing, or it was so uncertain and, you did not have the finished product in hand, but by the time, you got there, you needed it to be in hand. I can remember the movie Bad Boys, the first one, when they had narrowed down on who the bad guys were. The chief, when they came to shut him down because they thought that Martin Lawrence and Will Smith, that they were in on this drug robbery, right? So when they finally found, who the guys were and everything, but they didn't know where. So when this chief, because he was about to get fired and shut down the whole department, and he made the call, he said, I need helicopters, I need SWAT team, I need this and that. Only one thing, I don't know where I need them. I feel like this is kind of like the same thing, right? How it's like, they know that they're going to have to go to this, they are being sent to this priest, and, they do not have their healing. And, what would it be if they came to show themselves unto this priest being unhealed? How would that look, to the priest? How would that look on them? What would happen as a result? What would happen as a consequence? What kind of punishment would be given unto these men? Being warned and knowing that this is, this is the Levitical law, that they are not to be found, anywhere in these places. Because, for them to be leprous, that means they were pronounced unclean at some point by the priest. And if the priest pronounced you unclean, why are you coming back? Okay, so you came back, and what is the reason? And if they don't have a reason and, they are unhealed, then, what's going to happen to them? So this is going in a dire consequence, in a dire situation, rather. Because as they walk, have you ever forgotten to do your homework when you were little? And then, maybe you had some time in the morning, before that class, and how you would rush and try and put it together. It's like they're going to this priest and they do not have their healing. So now it's like, they're left with a task to rush and put this thing together. This is a crazy thing. How can we go and present and we're unclean? Then, it's just a test of obedience. I always say that God, he's always so grieved, with us. We walk in such a state of disobedience that, sometimes God, just to see an obedient person, is like a sight for sore eyes, which is really, I always say a testimony against us. How we walk in rebellion, how we walk in, not believing him, not believing that he exists, not believing his word, when he says certain things. How we walk in such a way that, is not conducive of the God that we are supposed to be serving. So it says, as they went, it came to pass as they went, they were healed. So how many steps did this take, right? How far did they walk? Was it like a 10 steps, were healed, a 20 steps? How about like 100, 500 steps? How far away did they go? And, was there a gradual healing with each step? Or did it just happen, to come to pass that after a certain number of steps, the next step that they took, they were completely healed. It says as they went, they were healed. So, this can be taken, you would jump to conclusion and say, well, this must mean a gradual thing. That as they went, gradually it was healed. But it can also mean, as they went, then there was just a cross point, a hard, solid division of being, not healed, versus being healed. Or so the last verse says, and one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back and with a loud voice glorified God. So, we see one of them, being healed. No, so like I said, what did this mean that he was within, a close enough distance to turn back and shout this, glory unto God and Jesus hear him? Was there a turning back? You know, what if this blessing was like Lot's wife? Just go and don't look back. And we would see him send a prophet, telling him to go and not look back. When they lied to him, how a lion met him by the way and slew him. We know that Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. What if this was a blessing? Go and don't look back. But we see this man. I guess the difference between Lot's wife is that Lot's wife, looking back is not giving no glory unto God. I think that that's maybe a defining criteria. For her, looking back, there was no glory unto God. Versus this man, he looked back to glorify God for no other reason, not to ask for anything. So there's a difference in heart posture. So, we see this man being so, enthralled, to receive this blessing, knowing that he's going to, get a chance to return to society. How long ago did he have this leprosy? Did it come unto him after he had time to get maybe, married with some children, and then getting to go back to them? Did it come on an earlier age where he did not, get a chance to secure anything like this? So now he's able to return, to society. I'm pretty sure when his family see him, they're going to be so surprised. Are the people gonna be apprehensive? Wondering, well, we know that he looks clean, but does he have traces? I don't know, maybe on certain parts of his skin or hands. Are they gonna be, nervous in his presence? Because this thing did it go all the way away, and even if it did, his clothes, are they all new clothes that he's wearing? Is there some left in the clothes that we can get, leprosy from? So one of them saw that he was healed. He turned back and glorified God. So we see a difference in gratitude of this man. And it's things like this that get you so far with God. I heard a question asked, how is it that two people can stand on the altar for healing and one gets healed and the other does not? Jesus himself said, two shall be in the field, one shall be taken, one left. Two shall be in the bed, one shall be taken, one left. Two shall be grinding at the mill, one shall be taken, one left. It's because of things like this. You see, his gratitude, how he turned back. This meant something different to him than the others. No doubt they were all glad to receive their healing, but we see a different operating system. Inside this man, the Bible says, "The meek shall inherit the earth." Right? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. These things they imply a pure in heart state and a certain state of meekness. As an indicator of an internal process that's going on. And these things is not by mistake or accident, right? So here we are, still in the early parts of the 17th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, and he said also to the disciples, it is impossible but that offenses must come. But woe unto that man by whom they do come. Better had it been for that man if a millstone was hung about his neck and he was cast into the sea, than he shall avenge one of these little ones. Take heed to yourself, if thy brother trespass against thee, rebuke him, and if he repent, forgive him. And he shall trespass, if he shall trespass against thee 7 times in one day, and 7 times in a day, turn to thee and say, I repent, then thou shalt forgive him. Then the apostle said unto the Lord, increase our faith. And he said unto them, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto the sycamore tree, be thou plucked up from the root and planted in the sea, and it shall obey thee. And which of you shall have a servant in the field, plowing or feeding cattle, and by, when he is come from the field, shall say, go and sit down to meat, and shall not rather say unto him, go and make ready wherewith I might sup, and gird thyself and serve me, and after I have eaten, then shalt thou eat and drink. I tell thee, does this Lord thank this servant because he did those things that were commanded of him? I trow not. Likewise, ye, when ye would have done all those things that were commanded of you, say, we are but unprofitable servants. We have done that which was our duty. So we pick up right here where it says, and it came to pass, as he went to Jerusalem, he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee. And when he was entering into a certain village, behold, there met him 10 men standing afar off, who were lepers. And when they saw him, they lifted up their voice, saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said, go and show thyself unto the priest. And it came to pass, as they went, they were cleansed. Now, behold, one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, and with a loud voice glorified God. I'm Straw Greenhorn.